Hello and welcome to Praxis. I'm Bronwyn Adcock. I'd like to welcome our live audience here in Sydney, those joining us via video link from Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and those of you watching on APAC or listening on radio. Today we're discussing education in a changing world. It's now well established that a quality education offers a child a vital leg up in life. But are we getting it right for those in the developing world? How do we ensure education quality and relevance? And should education be more geared towards finding employment? To discuss these issues and more, we're joined today by our panel. We have Yidan Wang, a Senior Education Specialist at the World Bank. Bernie Lovegrove, the Executive Director of ASPBAE Australia, the Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education. And Jack Maebuta, the outgoing Pacific Islands Research Fellow at the Australian National University in Canberra. Education is no longer seen as a privilege of the elite. It is a basic human right. We know that education is one of the strongest instruments for reducing poverty and improving health. It can promote gender equality, peace and stability. Yet despite this, many countries in the developing world are still a long way from meeting the 2015 Millennium Development Goals for education. Globally, 67 million school-aged children are not in school at all. Half of these are in sub-Saharan Africa. 40% are in fragile and conflict-affected states. In our region, half of all primary school-aged Papua New Guinean kids don't make it to school. In Kiribati, only around 1 in 3 of primary school leavers go on to secondary school. Of these, half end up dropping out altogether. But it's not just an issue of school attendance. There's evidence that some children who go to school are not learning effectively, coming away from several years of education without basic literacy and numeracy skills. In the Solomon Islands, for example, the net primary enrolment rate is nearly 100%, yet in one major province, less than a quarter of primary school kids are literate. What's more, a gap seems to exist between education and employment. Globally, youth unemployment is still incredibly high, with young people more than 3 times more likely to be unemployed. Despite high levels of primary school enrolment in the Solomon Islands, youth unemployment is still 60%. In the developing world, research suggests that many students are leaving school because they feel that the education system does not provide enough benefits relative to the costs of going to school. The challenge is one of making education relevant and ensuring that it serves to improve an individual's life, meeting their needs and the needs of wider society. To discuss this, I'll turn now to our panel. I'd like to start by asking a very simple question. What is the point of an education? Bernie, can you start for us?
Well, I think you made some good points in your introduction there. I think that intuitively we know that education, for those of us who've had the good fortune to have an education, we know what a difference it makes in our lives in terms of personal empowerment, in terms of individuals' ability to contribute to society and the wider world, and to know what's going on, the larger forces at play in one's country and in the larger world. And then, of course, there are many studies that have been done that show that for every extra year of education, incomes tend to increase individually, and economic growth is higher in countries where there are higher levels of education. There are health benefits. For example, I remember seeing a study in Kenya that for every extra year that a young girl had of education, she was that much less likely to contract HIV/AIDS, and indicators show that more educated women tend to have less children. So a whole other range of indicators suggest that education's a very important thing. And in studies that we've done in the Pacific, in Papua New Guinea, Solomons, Vanuatu, when we've asked the question to people, how important is education, it's up there with 90% of people recognise how important it is.
Yidan, is education only meaningful when it results in employment?
I think education serves several purposes, and all these purposes are not conflict to each other. First of all, education should enable people to maximize their skills, their ability, and these will help people to make a contribution to society effectively. And secondly, I think education should enable people to get a job, because then they can work, they can live a better life. I think those are the good purposes of education.
And Jack, how do you see the benefits of education in the Solomon Islands, for example?
In Solomon Islands, as far as education is concerned, it is very, very important, given the fact that the majority of people are living in rural areas. About 80% of people living in rural areas. And many of these people do not have access to quality education. So as far as education without whatever extrinsic means education is all about, it is very important, because it will help improve people's livelihood in all areas.
Yidan, we hear a lot of talk about education in a changing world and the challenges people now face in this changing world. When we talk about that, what kind of person are we talking about? Can you give me an example?
Okay, I will share you a true story of my high school classmate. Her name is Liang. She ranked number 2 out of a class of 72 in the city of Jilin in northeast part of China. When the time came for a national entrance examination for universities, and she was very ill, and she missed taking the examination. In the following years, only high school graduating class were able to take the national examination. So she had no chance to go to universities. Despite of her ability and effort, he had to work in the factory. In those days, in 1970s and in 1980s, she could at least expect to work in the factory for the rest of her life. But China launched economic reform, and her factory went bankrupt. She was unemployed at the age of 40. Later, a firm approached her and wanted to hire her to sell furniture to foreigners. But that job required an English language skill, which she didn't have, because we learned Russian at high school. Unfortunately, at that time, there was no non-degree English language programs available for adults. So since then, she had to work as a cleaner, earning $150 a month. I'm sure you will find many Liangs in your life and among your friends who are victims of the rigidity and the irrelevance of education system, and who cannot live their lives the fullest to reach their potential. Unfortunately, this situation persists even today, where knowledge and skills are key for individuals and the nation's development. In many developing countries, education systems still function as an elite system to sort out students instead of facilitating more in learning. It favors academic study over technical skills. It provides only one chance rather than second and multiple chances for learning. It is too formal to allow adults and the non-traditional students to get access to learning. In many developing countries, there is a mismatch between education and the labor market, with a large number of young people unemployed. At the same time, there are many positions unfilled because of lack of suitable candidates. Many graduating students are not prepared for the world of work. This situation is critical for today, and it will be even more critical for tomorrow, because between now and 2050, in all regions in the world except Europe, we'll see an upswing of working age population. For example, in Asia, the working age population will increase 22% by the year of 2050. In Pacific region, it will be 31%. In the Africa region, will be 125%. The key policy issues is to ensure the emerging working class population to have the right kind of knowledge and skills for them to escape the cycle of poverty. Hopefully, education will become enabler rather than a barrier in this development process.
So, Yidan, what kind of things can we do to make education systems work better in this changing world and serve the needs of people a lot better?
I think, first of all, education system needs to be flexible. Because if we are only thinking about young people and school-age children, there are a lot of people who are in the workplace who need to change a job, who need to update their skills, will now have a chance to do so. So that's not only a waste of human resources, but there are a lot of waste, a loss of opportunities for people. And secondly, education has to respond to the needs of the labor market, which we are not doing very well in that sense. Normally, education, even the vocational education, people decide what the learners should learn without understanding the change in the labor market. And that oftentimes results in the irrelevance of education.
Have we focused too much on access to primary education at the expense of secondary and vocational education, do you think?
In some part of the world, we are focusing a lot on primary education. We're talking about this important, getting the basic, which is important. But nowadays, because of the change of technology, for example, which has replaced a lot of human works, that result in the demand for high-skilled workforce, which requires the primary education is not enough. We need at least the secondary education and with at least some skills. So those are the things I think we need to pay attention to.
Bernie, what do you think? Should there be more of a focus beyond primary education?
I think so, but I wouldn't want to see a shift of resources out of allocations to primary education to other sectors. I think the pot needs to be larger for education. That's important and will continue to be so, that we have close to universal primary education. However, other areas have tended to be neglected in terms of allocation of resources, including for out-of-school youth and for adults, especially in rural and remote contexts.
Jack, I know you've spent a lot of time examining vocational education in the Solomon Islands. How important is vocational education for a country like the Solomon Islands?
Vocational education in Solomon Islands has come a very long way in terms of the programs that has been running over the past decades. This is very, very important. Policymakers see vocational education as very important. But the practice that is currently going on in the country doesn't reflect that importance in terms of contributing to the economic development of the country. So it stands as it is very important as far as development is concerned in Solomon Islands. But appropriating the practical training, that what remains one of the key challenges in Solomon Islands.
So what are some of the main challenges with the system that you've seen?
One of the key challenges is that in Solomon Islands education, we still have this academic orientation in terms of the curriculum. That's give more priority in terms of funding, in terms of giving the high status of number of kids going to schools. So people still have this attitude that, vocational education is for those people who are pushed out of the system. And yet, the formal system is not able to respond to the needs of what is currently happening in the country. So there needs to be a realization now that if we are able to contribute in terms of development in the country, we need to change this attitude. Vocational education needs to give the priority that is in terms of development in the country.
Can you paint a picture for me of what does a good vocational education program look like? What's some of the better cases that you've seen?
What I see as a practical type of vocational education is education that is, the curriculum is learning by doing. Because that is one of the problems in the Solomon Islands, that we are having these vocational programs going on either in secondary schools. We have like agriculture, industrial arts, business studies, but the way it is taught is not practical. We need a vocational education. If we need to respond to the changing needs of our society, it needs to be practical. And I've come across one particular model that is run in one of the rural training centers, that when the students are coming to the center, they were allocated a plot of land to farm that land, and they use their, the business skills as to how to manage that plot of land, and they sell their, the veggies in the market. Whatever income that they earn, the center will have to, open a bank account, and they keep putting in the profits. At the end of their 3 years, the principal will give them the passbook. This is your money. Go back to the village, and then you can start up something. In that way, you are able to put some meaning into what the students are learning. And when they go back to the village, they would be able to, start up something. Because the problem in the Solomon Islands is that those who are coming out of the rural training centers, even though they have those skills, when they go back to the rural areas, they don't see any prospect of earning a living, because there is not much going on in the rural areas in terms of economic activities. So as long we need to make our training more entrepreneurial in nature, despite whatever hardship they may come across when they finish, at least they would be able to start off something.
Bernie, looking specifically at education in Asia and the Pacific, which is your area, what do you think are the main issues that need to be tackled in order to see some concrete improvements?
Big question. There are multiple issues, and part of the problem is that I think we only tackle some of the problems and not all of them. And the analogy that comes to mind is like a bucket with about 7 holes in the bottom of the bucket, and we fill 3 of the holes. And so we obviously don't solve the problem. And until we address at the same time multiple problems, I don't think we'll be completely successful. So, for example, I think that, as Yidan was saying, and Jack, that we need contextually appropriate solutions. One size doesn't fit all. So we need to look at each context. A remote rural situation is so much different to an urban situation. The opportunities are so different. And we have to ask ourselves, there's often, it's said, training for what jobs? Where are the jobs? So sometimes there's clearly jobs that aren't being filled, but more often than not, there's training and there's no jobs at the end. So one question is, how can we provide a good quality education that equips people to live in a low cash or no cash economy? In various parts of the Pacific and in Timor-Leste, this is a big challenge. What sort of life skills learning would help them value their own place and country and living and working without much cash perhaps, but what skills and knowledge do they need that will help to have pride in that and do that better? I hear a lot from my Pacific colleagues, for example, that they are saddened that the young people leave and go to the big, the urban centres, and they don't seem to value so much traditional knowledge or living out on the land. And so I think it's a challenge to ensure that we have an integrated learning, holistic, that's not just focused on a particular job, that looks at a whole range of things, pride in one's culture and language, social responsibility for being a good citizen and in a community. These sorts of attributes and skills. And currently there is tends to be a divorce between, you go to a vocational training centre and you learn about how to fix a motor on a motorboat. But what about, where's the place for learning, you know, about human rights? Where's the place about being a responsible citizen? So how can we make sure that there's a rounded education that gives people practical, employable skills where there's jobs, but also broader life skills that enable them to cope better, like critical analysis skills, problem solving, planting the idea that I can learn actively by myself. I don't necessarily have to wait and enrol in another course. So,
picking up on that point that Bernie made, Yidan, how do we provide relevant education in countries where there is a significant subsistence or informal economy? What do we need to tackle there?
The informal sector. There are many countries have, particularly in developing countries, there's a large informal sector that is featured by not organized, low income, and not structured. And this is a very, very critical area, and that not many people have answers for that. The critical thing, I think, is for the educators to help these people to develop their own skills. I mean, self-employment, for example. Recently, I was in India, and to look at the vocational schools in India, and I found within the school, there are mothers and daughters are in the same program, and their programs range from 3 years to 8 months. So many of them are in the self-employment category. I think those programs are very flexible and help them to get self-employed. That's what the informal sector, I think, needs. Because the formal sector, like education at schools, is not very good preparing people for the informal sector jobs.
Bernie, again, looking at the Asia and the Pacific, do we see that flexibility now? You're talking about the need for these kind of flexible, location-specific education systems. Do you see many examples of that?
There are some examples, but I don't think there are nearly enough of them. I think that there's a lot of potential in flexible community learning centres in rural settings that can cater for different needs. So, for example, older people who never became literate, never had the chance to go to primary or secondary school, or dropped out far too early. Many of them would be too embarrassed to sit in a class of primary school aged children to get their primary qualification or secondary. So what about, you know, utilising existing infrastructure, schools that aren't used at night or on weekends, to provide classes for older youth and adults to gain a basic literacy, and then maybe pathways to give them an accreditation that gives them acceptance into maybe another vocational course of some sort. So these sorts of solutions. In Timor-Leste and in Bougainville, there's a whole generation that missed out on an education because of conflict. Those ex-combatants, you know, how do they get integrated back into society? These sorts of localised centres of learning and flexible responses could be one solution to enable them to regain confidence and knowledge. And that's another thing, you know, we talk about knowledge is power. And you often hear it said that, oh, in this day and age, everyone's got access to the internet and to mobile phones. But actually, that's not true. If you look at many rural and remote areas, internet access is very limited, and mobile phones are also quite limited. The infrastructure for communications technology is often not there. So if donors and governments wanted to strategically help part of the problem, it would be to roll out extensive access to affordable internet and mobile phone access that enabled poor people, people with in remote areas to communicate, find out and learn about things that would be useful for their local context. We see too often that there's sort of a monopoly by companies on phones and internet access, and the prices are too high and they're pitched for urban contexts. So that seems to me to be a great role for governments and donors to come in and say, well, we'll roll it out in rural and remote areas and give these people greater access. That can open up a whole world of online learning if those centres were set up with free or very low cost internet access.
Yidan, you had a point you wanted to raise?
Yeah, there are many examples outside the region that has interesting practice on the flexible structure in the education system. For example, in Brazil, the secondary school curriculum offered at night so that those who have to work during the daytime can attend the school after work. In the US, for example, US and UK, the community college level is the most flexible part of the education system. The community level, college level is kind of college, two-year college level that high school graduates can attend and immigrants can attend to learn languages, and even those who graduate from universities can attend to obtain one skill and get a certificate of it. So the trend nowadays in the US is the community college has 16% of the students who have degrees above bachelor to learn the skills. So it's a good opportunity for career change and the skill update opportunity.
Jack, in the Solomons, do you see that kind of flexibility as being important to have in the education systems?
Certainly is. I mean, in my view, what I see as really important is the fact that before providing that flexibility, we need to know what is the felt need on the ground. For example, I did a survey in 2009 in more than 200 households in a squatter settlement. And what I found is that these people are really in need of education in terms of what they were confronted with. For example, drug abuse. They don't have even a basic knowledge of what it is. So once you know where you are coming from and whatever community, then you would be able to appropriate that particular training in order to meet that particular need. And that's what flexibility is all about. Because once we are able to make a blanket cover sort of training, it may not fit. So on a more community level, like what Bernie is telling about, community learning center, using the schools. In the Solomon Islands, we have community high schools everywhere out in the rural areas, but they are not fully utilized in terms of providing flexible learning, flexible training to meet the community needs. But the concept of community learning is there. But how are we going to appropriate it? It depends on school teachers, policymakers, as how we are going to respond to the needs of community in the Solomon Islands. But the infrastructures are there. How to appropriate it and make it more relevant to the felt need is what is very important, in my view.
So Jack, what do you think are the steps that need to be taken to start getting there?
We already have at the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Education in Solomon Islands is called Ministry of Education and Human Resources Development. And a division in that ministry has a technical and vocational division in it. If those flexibility are tailored into what is already there and become part of the responsibility in delivering flexible training in the community as part of the community high school curriculum, then it should be okay, as what Bernie is saying. Well, you would be able to open up the door of the classroom after the kids go home at 2 o'clock and take in the mothers and use, like sewing classes. In that way, then you would be able to respond to the need as well. So when we look at the needs, it's not a need of those people who are in the system. I think that the greater need is already out in the community for those people who are mothers, who are fathers, who are trying to generate livelihood. That is the cohort that we need to also target in terms of providing flexible training to the community.
And I think it also is a great opportunity to build a sense of community cohesion because involving the local community, so it's our school, it's our learning centre, and taking roles in the governance of the school, in the upkeep of the school, and ensuring that the programs are relevant. It's a great way to actually help build local community. So.
Okay, we will go now to some questions. Do we have any questions from the audience in Sydney?
Thank you very much, all of you, for a very interesting presentation. I'm Anne-Marie O'Keefe, Acting Director of the Melanesia Program at the Lowy Institute. You've given us a tour d'horizon which has given us a lot of food for thought, but I guess two issues that didn't come up is the very limited resources, including just simply teachers, in a number of the countries, particularly in the Pacific. And the other issue is the role of the private sector. Now, Bernie, you talked about technology, internet, etc. We've seen in PNG, for example, the role that Digicel has played in rolling out massive uptake of access to mobile telephony. So what role do you see for the private sector in this to overcome some of the real resource constraints that a number of these countries have in delivering sort of education services required?
Bernie, would you like to take it on?
Well, I think at least three stakeholders need to take some responsibility for resourcing. Governments themselves, I think, need to allocate a higher percentage of their budgets to education. Secondly, donors need to come good with increased and better targeted education aid. Now, you sometimes hear donors throw their hands up and say, look, we already pour so much money into this country or that country for education aid, and what's it done? But half the problem is not enough of the funds are given to help build the local government infrastructure so that they can effectively implement education and implement education programs. Some monies are given, of course, to institutional strengthening, but clearly that's still an ongoing need, is greater resources to government education institutions and infrastructure to get them to do their job better. Private sector, yeah, I mean, I think a lot more needs to be done, conversations between government and donors and the private sector about how they can creatively collaborate to make sure that jobs that are there, people are steered towards them. We do hear still of instances where some employers, say in the Pacific, can't find anybody with the right set of skills. Now that's amazing. You would think with such high unemployment, that gap, that mismatch needs to be addressed. What can private sector do about that? Are they doing their bit in terms of apprenticeships? Rather than just being passive about it and saying, okay, government, deliver us people with this skill set, can they be more active, proactive in saying, okay, let's do a collaborative course here where we'll provide some inputs, some mixture of work on the job experience with some training from elsewhere. So certainly more creative involvement of the private sector and of course local communities themselves so that the types of jobs are consistent with the local way of living.
Okay. I have a question from the Solomon Islands for Yidan. It's from George Semaine. He's a school principal in Honiara. He says education should provide knowledge and skills for life rather than just for the labour market. Why have you taken the view that education is for the labour market?
Okay. I think that people may pursue primary education or secondary education or tertiary education or vocational skills, but education itself is not ultimate goal. Once you get education, you need to involve in the world of work, right? You learn something, you want to contribute to the society. That's why I think that education and the labor market is linked. You just don't want to get education and not work, and you need to contribute to society. That's, I think, from that angle, I think education needs to link to the labor market.
Well, I think equally it's important not to forget that education and life is so much bigger than work. And, you know, if we just focus on a basic education and then work-related education, where do people learn about social responsibility? Where do they learn about their human rights? Where do they learn about broader issues like gender and caring for the environment? So somewhere in their education, and not just in one spot, like only in primary school, along the way it needs to be, I think, integrated into, I agree with you, effective job-oriented learning as well. So one question is, on-the-job training, to what extent can its curriculum be expanded to integrate some of these other life skills learnings? And it's quite interesting, in your report I noticed that you were saying that a lot of employers are now asking for higher order skills, not just the ability to sew, not just the ability to fix a motor, but problem solve, creative thinking, lateral thinking. Where do these skills come from? So it needs, employers are now also looking for a more rounded curriculum that deals with these different skill needs.
What do you think, Jack, on this topic?
Yeah, the other perspective to look at that is that to what extent the system that we are having is responding to creating education for life. Because for many people, like, you go to school to work. I mean, that's the end. Like, okay, I get a university degree, then I need to look for a job. So, as Bernie is saying, we need to offer this holistic set of skills, knowledge, to prepare a person to live life meaningfully, no matter whatever situation he or she will be finding herself in, but education has provided something for that particular individual. Whether it's going to be work, whether it's going to be something else, but he or she would be able to survive in whatever conditions or situation he or she will be confronted with in future.
I think education, the purpose of education is beyond just to find a job, because education conveys a lot of values for a person to develop in the future. Nowadays, because of the globalization, it's important for people to understand the different cultures. Even if you live in a society, for example, in the city, you see so many foreigners on the street. In the globalized world, people need to understand each other better. And first of all, people need to be a good citizen rather than the jobs. So getting job is one thing, and prepare people for good citizens and have a good values. And it's also very important of the purpose of education.
Okay. We have another question from the Solomon Islands. It's for Bernie. It's from Joash Manapuri, who's the Educational Director of the South Seas Evangelical Church. How can we harmonise between education that is personally relevant and one that meets national and international goals as expressed in the Millennium Development Goals?
Good question. And there's a lot of harmonisation there as well. When a person becomes more personally empowered, starts to think more critically, starts to accept that I as an individual have a responsibility in my community, and then for my country, and then as a global citizen, the linkages start to become more obvious. And so I'm glad that those Millennium Development Goals were raised, because they are crucial goals, and that helps remind us of those broader and wider developmental objectives that we're all looking to address.
Okay, I have another question from the Solomons for Jack. It's from Joshua Latawa, the Education CEO in Guadalcanal Province. Why do parents invest a lot of money in sending their children to school for A, white-collar jobs, B, self-employment, or C, survival? How do you design an education system that satisfies the wishes of the parents?
I think the best way to start before designing any policy or any training is that to have a wider consultation. Because what I see has been the problem in the Solomon Islands is that people up at the decision-making level say that, yes, we need vocational education because that's what we need. But there is no wider consultation. So people down at the village level, they still want, academic type of education, because they see that there is more prestige status in the kids when they are able to work in an offices. They don't see that, when you become a plumber or whatever, you become a farmer, you still do something in terms of economic development. So we need to change that mindset. If there is no wider consultation in preaching to the people out in the community areas that we need to introduce this sort of reform. There has been a lot of reforms in the Solomon Islands, reforms after reforms, all under the same concept. We have the provincial secondary school system for 3 years running vocational-based education. Before that, we have a 2-year program called New Secondary Schools that was introduced in the 70s. Those initiatives were targeted as offering vocationally based education. It didn't pull through because parents are still persisting that we want academic type of education. So as long this mentality is still out there, no matter how much we want to change in terms of policy, it may never work. So wider consultation, more awareness, why vocational education is important. Yes, parents, they put so much investment in their kids, but they need to understand that when they go reach now in the Solomon Islands, even those people with degrees coming out from the University of the South Pacific are still looking for jobs. That is the reality that we are faced with right now. As long as we are not able to understand that reality, then whatever policies that is going to come will never work. We need to change the mindset of the people.
Okay, I think we'll take a question from our audience in Sydney now.
I was very interested I had a look at your paper, Dr. Wang, and I was interested in what you had to say about education prepares people for both the society of today and the future. My question, I think it's actually been implicit in a lot of what's been said so far, is what kind of future are we thinking of? And in the world that we live in today and the sorts of challenges that we're faced with. And what does it mean in terms of all levels of education? How can we respond in ways that are actually going to enhance the opportunities of young people so that they can live productive and creative lives? It seems to me that that is a major challenge, and among those challenges are questions of equity, questions of social justice, questions of human rights. I noticed that a couple of the questions that were asked from our friends overseas, they raised the question of education for life. And the question that I pose, and I think it's a really fundamental one, is when they actually raise the question of education for life, what kind of life are we looking for? What kind of life are we looking for 5, 10, 20, 30 years out from now? And what does that mean in terms of what needs to happen for our schools? What needs to happen in terms of adequate resourcing? What does it mean in terms of community involvement? What does it mean in terms of reorienting many of the priorities that we currently have, including, among other things, the enormous money that's being allocated to military expenditure. $1.5 trillion each year is being spent on the military. What does it mean in terms of some of the basic needs of our up-and-coming citizenry?
It's a very good question, but it's also a very, very challenging question. Yeah. I read a book written by Gardner from Harvard. He's talking about 5 minds in the future. That disciplined mind, the creative mind and everything, I think in the future, the world, in the country's development is very much depend on not only the knowledge and basic ideas, but also how creative you are. There are, in many countries, like US and others, they're trying to prepare students for, to be creative, to have new ideas, to, just routinely, not just following what other people's doing. So that kind of thing, I think, is really, some countries are trying to prepare their students for. And the other thing is, I think that the education should prepare the opportunities for people to develop themselves rather than to control them for doing so. Because right now, education is very much focused on the rote memories, which really constrain students from developing their new ideas, think creatively. And the other example I found is quite fascinating is that recently I watched a TV in China there was a debate on this young kid who is 16 years old, who has written the nation's best-selling books, but he failed many subjects in high school. So then the question is, should he drop his writing career and go back to school to finish high school, or he should drop out of high school and pursue the writing? So what do you think? There are many people nowadays, like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and everybody. They had this innovative idea when they were young. And then if you allow this person, does not allow a person to drop school and continue with the university, maybe 4 years later, he's just a normal person. But if education system is flexible enough, then he started to pursue whatever he's doing the best. Maybe in a few years, he has out of his own inspiration, and then he can still go back to pursue. But if education system is very rigid and provide only one chance, and that person has to continue. Otherwise, after a few years, he's nobody. He couldn't get a school of education to develop in the future. I thought that might be.
Bernie or Jack, would you like to jump in here?
Well, I think it's hard to know what the world's going to be like in 20 years' time, say, and to some extent, the best we can do is provide education that equips as many people as possible to cope with change, flexibility to be able to respond to factors that influence their lives, and that includes, as I was mentioning before, critical analysis skills, able to read what's going on in society. That also presumes access to knowledge. So that's another important plank of any future strategy, is increasing everybody's access to knowledge. We talked about social and global responsibility, and that's the ability to respond is, I think, a key part of the future, both at the communal level and more globally. And skills to keep on learning, that I, by myself, can take efforts to then continue learning after being given a basic initial thrust of how I might go about learning. They would be some of the set of skills into the future that would equip us. If I could quickly go back to, I think, a question that Anne-Marie was asking about teachers. We haven't said a whole lot about teachers, and yet half the problem, or part of the problem, is there are not enough teachers. They're often poorly trained themselves, and they're not fairly paid. And so part of the problem is, in many places, I think we'll all have experiences and knowledge of, and my Pacific colleagues tell me of teachers who go home who aren't there half the week. Why is that? Because their pay is so low. Sometimes they have to go and find additional work to make ends meet. So no wonder children leave school and say it's irrelevant or it's not a very rewarding experience if that's the sort of teaching experience that they're having. Evidence in the Solomons is saying that the demand still outstrips supply. There's more kids want to go to TVET than spaces in the vocational centres. So we need more TVET teachers. So that doesn't come from dust. It means donors, for example, have to cover an increased amount of those costs, because in places like the Pacific, there's not the economic base. Those governments can't raise enough from taxes and other means to meet the educational needs of all their people, while still meeting other development needs as well. You could argue, of course, that they need to reprioritise, but even with that, for decades to come, they will need the support of donors like Australia to keep providing significant education aid.
Jack, is that an issue in the Solomons, a lack of suitably qualified teachers?
Exactly. What we have been experiencing in the Solomons is that, the increasing rate of community high schools, that's where we have been experiencing a shortage of teachers. So what is now the current practice is that, those students who left at the end of, for example, year 12 were recruited as, untrained teachers to teach in the community high schools. And, you know, it has been going on for some times now. So the issue of qualified teachers in the Solomons is still one of the key challenges in terms of providing quality education, both in the formal system, vocational, they're all the same. Yeah.
Okay. I have a question from the Solomon Islands. It's for Bernie and Yidan. It's from Cipriano Nuaki, who's the Education Secretary. How much influence is economic status to educational development and human development?
Well, I think as we were mentioning right at the start, the other way around, that where countries have good human development indicators and have good education systems, they experience high individual incomes, higher, and they experience relatively higher economic growth. So there is a clear link in terms of economic status and education and development.
I think maybe to understand from the other perspective, on the other hand, is that low-income countries may have more opportunities to develop, because there are a lot of potentials to develop primary education, secondary education, TVET. If there is a demand from the labor market and for skills, then there is a big room for the development of vocational technical education. Did that answer the question?
Okay, we have some time for a question from Sydney.
Education didn't arrive with the white man's world or the Asian world. Education was already in the Pacific long before foreign explorers and other people came in. It's custom education. The white people brought in this thing which we call scratching leaves, writing on, you know, ABC, you know. Don't denigrate traditional education. Traditional education has been educating Pacific Islanders and Melanesians for tens of thousands of years and has enabled them to survive well in areas that modern white people and foreigners have a hard time surviving. We feel in many areas in Vanuatu, I've spent nearly half of the last 40 years working with traditional cultures in Vanuatu, supporting their views. Many of them are very dubious about the benefits of modern education. They say it steals our children away from us. What is hoped, okay, balance the two. Get traditional education, link it with modern education. Make modern education relevant for people in the Pacific, or in the Western Pacific. Doesn't have to be education for jobs, as Jack and everybody are saying. The jobs are not there. Don't make the mistake of saying money has to be the aim of everything. Train people for sustainability, because if you've read the latest thing to come out of a group of American scientists published in Nature magazine last month, and it's just doing the rounds this weekend, they're predicting, using the latest computer models, that a complete and irreversible breakdown of the Earth's biosphere before the year 2100. Now, this is the kind of thing that everybody has to be worrying about, training for sustainability. In a way, forget about jobs and things like that. Training so that we can survive. Okay, yeah. Thank you very much.
Education systems in the developing world, are they too Western-centric?
I think they are. I think there's a lot of evidence where curriculums have been brought in from outside, whether it's the Australian curriculum or a New Zealand curriculum or somewhere else, and that's caused all sorts of problems. And I always hear around the Pacific a desire to respect more traditional knowledge and to draw on it more, and I think that's one way of regaining local community pride and ownership over community-based education, is to respect knowledge, traditional knowledge and culture and language as a large part of learning that young people undertake when they go through their training.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, I think it is the perception of the students as well. Like in most Pacific culture, as far as I know, is that they don't give much significance to the traditional knowledge in terms of what is learned in the classroom. They thought, oh, no, this is not what knowledge to us, because they thought that that's what they have been living with. But that needs to be reinforced, because our traditional skills and knowledge is very, very important, and in most Pacific culture, they are vanishing. And I came across one, when I was doing one educational awareness, one elder in a village asked me, what do you mean by literacy? Because, you know, those of us who are living in the village, from a white man's perspective, you look at us, you say, we can read and write. But can you navigate an ocean-going boat using the stars? I said, no. I said, then you are illiterate. That speaks of how important our traditional knowledge are. We need to harness that, and we need to make sure that they also go along in line to whatever formal education we are providing in our schools.
Okay, I have a question from the Solomon Islands for Jack. It's from Patrick, the Director of Curriculum. How can technical vocational education training sector align itself with the school curriculum to achieve better life skills in the Solomon Islands?
Thank you, Patrick. I think what I see as one of the way forward is how vocational curriculum can be integrated meaningfully into the Solomon Islands secondary curriculum, for example. I think there has been so many initiatives and reforms that have been done over the years, but they doesn't implement adequately. And what I begin to see as important step forward is if we want to make vocational training more practical as much as possible, it needs to be, the curriculum from the primary, secondary needs to be vocationalized. I mean, that's what my perspective is, because if we are going to run those two systems differently, people will still have this perception that this is second grade, this is first grade. As long as it is going to be meaningfully integrated by way of vocationalizing, so that when you learn English in a world, in a real world situation, in the hotel industry, working in a company and all this. But if that is not done, then we will still have this problem of this is academic, this is vocational, this is for the more bright students, this is for the failures.
Okay. We have time for one very quick question. Again, it's for you, Jack, from the Solomon Islands, from James Bossamata from the Ministry of Education. How do we address the current trend where university graduates are still looking for jobs?
I don't have any answers for that. I think what needs to be done is at the policy-making level. Solomon Islands, as far as the human resources development is concerned, we need to give scholarships. What is the use of training so many people with degrees, and then after all they come back, they are not able to, find jobs in the country? So people who at the national decision-making body need to realize that. We need to train people in this particular area. So I begin to see that there is a mismatch as far as human development needs in Solomon Islands is concerned. Because if we are not able to address that, then we will be training people after every year, and now then they come back, start to look for jobs. There is no jobs. But there are skill-related areas that needs to develop in Solomon Islands in order to generate more economic activities.
Bernie?
Well, a part of that is a topic that we haven't really touched on in this discussion so far, is the whole issue of migrant work. And I think that one part of the solution strategy is to, for countries like Australia, to be much more generous and flexible in terms of accepting workers from the Pacific, for example. New Zealand, of course, is doing quite a bit. Australia could do a lot more. It's hard to imagine, in a way, better ways of assisting rural parts of the Pacific than enabling some of their community members to come to a place like Australia, take on seasonal work or work for a period, learn on the job, take some income and churn that back into the local rural economy. And of course remittances are such a large and growing part of economies in the Pacific. It's something that that whole area of how to use skilled and educated people, flexibility between coming and going between Australia and other developing countries.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you to our panellists and thank you to everyone for coming today.